galaxy had written humanity off as a relic species. While other civilizations soared through hyperspace in sleek vessels powered by quantum cores and dimensional drives, humans still crawled between stars in what the Galactic Council mockingly called antique tin cans, ships built with primitive fusion drives and basic metal hulls. What the galaxy didn't know was that humanity's primitive technology contained secrets that would soon turn the tide of the greatest war the universe had ever seen. Sometimes the old ways aren't obsolete. They're just waiting for the right moment to remind everyone why they survived this long. When the unstoppable devourers arrived to consume all sentient life, the advanced races with their perfect technology fell like dominoes. But humanity's ancient spacecraft, dismissed and ridiculed for centuries, would prove that there is something to be said for building things to last and for never forgetting how to fight dirty. Commander Sarah Chen stood on the observation deck of the UES Defiance, watching the sleek alien ships of the Galactic Defense Fleet arrange themselves in perfect formation ahead of her ragtag human squadron. Even through the reinforced titanium steel composite windows of her ancient vessel, she could feel the weight of 1,000 condescending stares from the crews of those advanced ships. The Defiance was old. Not just old by galactic standards, but old by human standards too. Built nearly 4 centuries ago during humanity's first tentative steps into interstellar space, she was a relic of an era when humans still believed in building things to last forever. Her hull was thick, almost ridiculously so by modern standards. Where other ships used elegant energy shields and dimensional barriers, the Defiance relied on 3 meters of layered armor plating. Where others used exotic matter containment, she used magnetic fields so powerful they could crush a small moon. Behind Chen, her crew moved with practiced efficiency across the bridge. Lieutenant Marcus Torres adjusted the fusion reactor output, his hands dancing over controls that most other species considered laughably primitive. Chief Engineer Yuki Nakamura monitored the ship's systems from a console that looked like it belonged in a museum. Every surface was covered with physical switches, manual overrides, and analog displays that glowed with warm amber light. The irony wasn't lost on Chen that humanity's own government had been trying to retire ships like the Defiance for decades. The newer human vessels followed galactic design principles, sleek, efficient, and dependent on complex computer systems that could think faster than any biological mind. But budget constraints and bureaucratic delays had kept the old ships in service, relegated to patrol duties in the outer systems where nothing important ever happened. Until today. The communication system crackled to life, filling the bridge with the melodious tones of Admiral Zephay of the crystalline hegemony. The alien's translator rendered his words in perfect standard galactic, though Chen could hear the barely concealed disdain beneath the diplomatic politeness. "Commander Chen, your squadron will maintain position at the rear of our formation. When the Devourers arrive, you are to provide moral support to our main battle line. Your vessels are not equipped for modern warfare, and we cannot risk them compromising our tactical coordination." Chen gritted her teeth. The Devourers had already consumed 12 star systems, turning thriving worlds into empty husks drained of all life and energy. Every species in the galaxy had contributed their finest ships to this last desperate defense of the sanctuary system, where over 1 billion refugees from the consumed worlds had gathered on the planet Haven. Everyone except humanity, apparently, which had only been allowed to contribute its antique vessels. "Understood, Admiral," Chen replied, keeping her voice level. "The human squadron will maintain rear position." The transmission cut off, and Chen could hear the snickers from some of her younger crew members. She couldn't blame them. Compared to the graceful curves and impossible geometries of the alien vessels, human ships looked like flying bricks. The crystalline hegemony's ships seemed to be carved from living diamond, their surfaces rippling with internal light. The ethereal Republic's vessels phased in and out of normal space, existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Machine Collective's craft were perfect geometric forms that reconfigured themselves constantly, optimizing for every possible combat scenario. And then there were the humans, flying in ships that looked like they'd been built in a factory rather than grown in a quantum garden or forged in a stellar core. But Chen had served on the Defiance for 15 years, and she knew something the aliens didn't. The old ships had been built during humanity's most paranoid period, when every nation on Earth expected to fight a war that would end civilization. The engineers who designed them hadn't been trying to impress anyone. They'd been trying to build weapons that would still function after everything else had failed. The first of our ships appeared on the edge of the system, like wounds in space itself. They didn't emerge from hyperspace or phase shift from another dimension. They simply materialized, as if reality had suddenly remembered they were supposed to be there. The vessels defied easy description. They seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating holes in the starfield that hurt to look at directly. Admiral Zefhay's voice filled the communication channels, calm and confident. All ships advance to engagement range, deploy quantum barriers, and charge exotic particle weapons. Today we show these parasites that the galaxy will not go quietly into extinction. The alien fleet moved forward with breathtaking coordination, thousands of ships flowing like a school of fish, their formation shifting and adapting to present the optimal firing solution. Energy discharges lit up the void as massive weapons systems came online. The sight was beautiful and terrible, representing the accumulated military might of dozens of spacefaring civilizations. Chen watched her tactical display as the first exchange of fire began. The Devourer's ships released clouds of something that sensors couldn't properly identify, a dark mist that seemed to eat sensor beams and deflect energy weapons. The alien fleet's opening salvo, enough firepower to sterilize a planet. Then the Devourers returned fire. What came back wasn't energy beams or particle streams, but something far worse. Tendrils of absolute nothingness reached out from the dark ships, and wherever they touched, reality simply ceased. A crystalline hegemony cruiser, beautiful and diamond bright, was caught by one of the tendrils. Chen watched in horror as the massive vessel was simply deleted from existence, not destroyed but erased, as if it had never been built at all. The alien fleet's formation began to waver as ship after ship vanished into the hungry void. Their weapons, designed to fight conventional matter and energy, had no effect on an enemy that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of physics. Panic spread through the communication channels as officers in a dozen languages tried to understand what they were fighting. Lieutenant Torres looked up from his console, his face pale. "Commander, Admiral Zefhai is requesting that all reserve units advance to support the main battle line." Chen stared at the tactical display, watching the alien fleet being systematically erased. The Devourers were methodical, patient. They didn't hurry. They didn't need to. They had time, and their enemies clearly didn't. "Ma'am," Chief Nakamura called from her engineering station, "the quantum field generators on the lead ships are destabilizing. Whatever those things are doing, it's affecting the fundamental forces that hold matter together." Chen made her decision. "All ships, this is Defiance. Ignore the retreat order. We're going in." The response from her captains was immediate and unanimous. Captain Rodriguez of the UES Vengeance. "Vengeance is with you." Captain Kim of the UES Retribution. "Retribution ready for action." One by one, the old human ships acknowledged her orders. Admiral Zefhai's voice cut across the channel, sharp with panic and anger. "Commander Chen, you will withdraw immediately. Your primitive vessels cannot survive what is destroying our ships." "With respect, Admiral," Chen replied, settling into her command chair, "our primitive vessels are all you have left." She turned to her weapons officer. "Mr. Petrov, what's our status on the kinetic batteries?" Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Petrov, a bear of a man who'd served on military vessels since before humanity joined the galactic community, smiled grimly. "All railguns loaded and charged, Commander. Tungsten penetrators, just like the old days. Quote, navigation plot an intercept course for the largest Devourer vessel. Full burn on the fusion drives." The Defiance shuddered as her massive engines ignited, pushing the ancient vessel forward with a thrust that would have crushed the crew of any modern ship. But human vessels had been built with acceleration couches and inertial dampeners that could handle the stress of high-G maneuvers, because humans had learned to fight in space the hard way. As the human squadron accelerated toward the enemy, Chen could see the surviving alien ships falling back in confusion. Their elegant weapons and sophisticated defenses had proven useless against an enemy that operated by rules no one understood. But humans had faced the unknown before, and they'd learned that sometimes the simplest approach was the most effective. The Defiance entered weapons range, and Chen gave the order she'd been waiting to give her entire career. All ships, open fire. Show them what 400 years of human engineering can do. The railgun spoke with voices of thunder, hurling slugs of tungsten at a significant fraction of light speed. No exotic particles, no quantum entanglement, no dimensional manipulation, just simple, brutal kinetic energy applied with precision and overwhelming force. The projectile struck the nearest Devourer vessel, and for the first time in the battle, the enemy ships reacted with something that might have been surprise. The dark hull cracked. Chen smiled as damage reports flooded in from the Devourer ship. Whatever they were, whatever rules of physics they operated under, they still existed in normal space. And in normal space, conservation of energy was still the law. Reload and fire again, she ordered. Let's see how much reality these things can actually ignore. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since the Devourers had appeared, Chen felt something like hope. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had failed against this threat, but humanity's ancient, primitive, wonderfully crude spacecraft were still in the fight, and they were just getting started. The first Devourer ship died screaming. Chen had never heard anything like it before. The sound came through the hull itself, vibrations that bypassed the communication systems and resonated directly through the metal bones of the Defiance. It was a sound of genuine pain, transmitted through a medium no one understood. As the dark vessel's hull finally gave way under the relentless pounding of tungsten projectiles traveling at 12% of light speed, the alien ship didn't explode in any conventional sense. Instead, it seemed to collapse inward, the impossible darkness of its hull folding and twisting until it became a point of absolute nothingness that hurt to perceive. Then, with a flash that registered across every spectrum from radio to gamma, it was gone. Not destroyed, but translated into something else entirely. For a moment, the entire battle stopped. Devourer and Defender alike seemed frozen by the implications of what had just happened. One of the seemingly invincible enemy vessels had been killed by weapons that the galaxy's greatest military minds had dismissed as hopelessly primitive. Admiral Zevhai's voice crackled over the communication system, shock evident even through the translator's perfect diction. "How, Commander Chen, report your weapon specifications immediately. Our tactical computers show that kinetic weapons should have no effect on Devourer hull composition." Chen was studying her own tactical displays, trying to understand what her weapons had accomplished that the alien sophisticated armaments could not. The Defiance's sensors were crude by galactic standards, but they were also direct. While alien ships relied on quantum field analysis and exotic particle detection, human sensors simply measured what was actually there. "Chief Nakamura," she called to her engineering officer, "what do our scans tell us about the remaining Devourer ships?" The engineer's fingers flew over her console, pulling up readings that probably made no sense to anyone who hadn't spent decades working with human technology. "Commander, the ships register as having mass, significant mass. Whatever they're made of, it's not some exotic matter that exists outside normal physics, it's just arranged in ways our computers don't recognize." Lieutenant Torres looked up from his tactical station, his young face bright with understanding. "Commander, request permission to implement Doctrine 7. Chen felt a cold smile spread across her face. Doctrine 7 was something no human ship had been authorized to use in over a century, not since the brutal colonial wars that had nearly torn apart the early interstellar settlements. It was a tactical philosophy that predated humanity's membership in the galactic community, developed during an era when human military doctrine was simple, direct, and absolutely ruthless. "Granted, Lieutenant. Signal all ships to implement Doctrine 7, full authorization." Across the human squadron, captains who had served in the outer system patrols suddenly straightened in their chairs. They all knew the doctrine, had drilled on it during the long, boring months when nothing ever happened in the frontier systems. But none of them had ever expected to use it in actual combat. Doctrine 7 was brutally simple. When facing an unknown enemy, use overwhelming kinetic force to disable their mobility, then close to point-blank range and continue firing until the target ceased to exist. No fancy maneuvering, no attempt to preserve the enemy vessels for study, no consideration for prisoners or salvage. It was warfare reduced to its most basic elements, designed by military planners who had learned that the universe was a hostile place where mercy was often fatal. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the squadron channel, grim satisfaction evident in his tone. Vengeance acknowledging Doctrine 7. Request permission to show these alien friends how humans really fight. The second wave of the attack began with a coordinated railgun barrage that lit up the void with streaks of accelerated metal. But this time, the human ships weren't trying to destroy the Devourer vessels outright. Instead, they targeted what looked like propulsion systems, the strange appendages that jutted from the dark hulls like wings made of crystallized shadow. The effect was immediate and devastating. Devourer ships that had been moving with fluid grace suddenly lurched and spun as their propulsion systems were shattered by tungsten penetrators. The aliens had built their ships to be immune to energy weapons and exotic particle attacks, but they hadn't considered the possibility that someone might simply try to physically break their vessels apart. Chen watched the tactical display with growing satisfaction as human ships closed distance with the crippled Devourer vessels. At point-blank range, the railguns became even more effective, their projectiles penetrating deep into alien hulls that had seemed invulnerable just minutes before. "Commander," called Petrov from his weapons station, "we're getting some kind of feedback through the targeting computers. It's like the enemy ships are trying to communicate with our systems." That was interesting and potentially dangerous. Chen had heard reports from other engagements that the Devourers somehow corrupted the computer systems of their enemies, turning sophisticated AI assistants and tactical networks against their own operators. It was one reason the advanced alien fleets had been so helpless against the invasion, but human ships from the old era had a significant advantage in that regard. Their systems were almost entirely manual, with computer assistance limited to basic calculations and fire control. A Devourer might be able to corrupt a quantum-entangled AI that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, but it would have trouble doing much damage to a targeting computer that was essentially a very sophisticated calculator. "Isolate all computer systems from external inputs," Chen ordered. "If these things want to try their hacking tricks, they can talk to a wall." Mr. Petrov switched to manual targeting. The Russian weapons officer grinned and reached for a set of controls that hadn't been used in actual combat for decades. Manual targeting meant using human eyes and human reflexes to aim weapons that could destroy cities. It was inefficient, inaccurate, and completely immune to electronic warfare. It was also devastatingly effective against enemies who had learned to rely on corrupting their opponents' computer systems. The Defiance's next salvo was guided by nothing more sophisticated than Petrov's experienced eye and steady hand. The tungsten projectiles struck their target with the kind of precision that only came from a lifetime of practice punching through the Devourer ship's hull and into whatever passed for its vital systems. The alien vessel's response was immediate and terrifying. Tendrils of absolute darkness lashed out toward the Defiance, the same weapons that had erased the elegant ships of the Galactic Defense Fleet from existence, but Chen had been watching those weapons carefully and she'd noticed something important. "Emergency maneuvers," she shouted. "All power to engines, 90-degree port turn." The Defiance responded like the warship she'd been built to be. Her massive fusion engines flared to full power, generating enough thrust to liquefy any unprotected human but safely absorbed by acceleration systems designed for high-G combat. The ancient vessel twisted away from the reaching darkness with an agility that surprised everyone who had ever called human ships clumsy and primitive. The Devourer's weapon missed by less than a kilometer, close enough that the Defiance's sensors registered a complete absence of everything where the tendril passed. Matter, energy, even space-time itself seemed to recoil from the alien weapon's touch. But the weapon had missed, and that was what mattered. The Devourers had grown used to fighting enemies whose ships were too sophisticated for their own good. Vessels that relied on predictable, computer-controlled maneuvers and elegant formations. Human ships, crude and manually operated, were proving harder to predict and target. Chen keyed her communication system to the squadron frequency. All ships, the enemy's primary weapons, have limited tracking ability, use random evasive patterns, and close to minimum range. We're going to finish this the old-fashioned way. Across the human formation, ancient warships began moving in ways that would have seemed chaotic to any computer system but made perfect sense to the human crews that operated them. Captain Kim's Retribution performed a barrel roll that would have been impossible for any ship dependent on automated flight systems. Captain Thompson's UES Indomitable simply shut down half her engines and used attitude thrusters to spin like a top while continuing to fire her railguns. The Devourers, for the first time in their campaign of galactic conquest, found themselves facing opponents they couldn't easily predict or counter. Their sophisticated weapons, designed to destroy ships that followed logical tactical doctrines, struggled to track targets that moved according to human intuition and experience rather than computer algorithms. Meanwhile, the human weapons continued their methodical work of destruction. Railgun after railgun spoke, hurling simple masses of metal at velocities that turned them into weapons capable of cracking planets. The Devourer ships, for all their seeming invulnerability, couldn't ignore the fundamental laws of physics when several tons of tungsten impacted their hulls at relativistic speeds. One by one, the alien vessels began to die. Not the quick, clean death of energy weapon strikes, but the slow, grinding death of ships being literally beaten apart by weapons that treated their exotic hull materials as just another obstacle to overcome. Admiral Zephy's voice returned to the communication channels, no longer condescending but filled with desperate hope. "Commander Chen, the surviving fleet vessels are requesting permission to support your attack. What are your tactical recommendations?" Chen looked at the remains of the once mighty galactic defense fleet. Less than a quarter of the original ships remained, their crews shaken by the loss of vessels they'd considered invincible. But they were still willing to fight, and Chen respected that kind of courage. "Admiral, have your ships maintain distance and provide sensor support. Our weapons work because they're simple, but your ships have better detection systems than we do. Help us find their weak points and we'll exploit them." It was a partnership born of desperation, but it worked. The alien ships, with their sophisticated sensors and quantum processing arrays, could identify structural vulnerabilities in the Devourer vessels that human sensors couldn't detect. The human ships, with their crude but effective weapons, could then target those weak points with devastating precision. The battle began to turn in humanity's favor, but Chen knew it was far from over. The Devourers still outnumbered them significantly, and more enemy ships were emerging from the dark reaches of space with each passing hour. But for the first time since the invasion began, it was the enemy that seemed to be adapting to human tactics rather than the other way around. Chen settled back into her command chair and prepared for the long fight ahead. The galaxy had learned to scoff at human military technology, dismissing it as primitive and outdated. Today, those primitive weapons were the only thing standing between civilization and extinction, and humanity was just getting warmed up. The battle had been raging for 6 hours when Chief Engineer Nakamura made a discovery that changed everything. Chen was coordinating the fourth wave of attacks against the Devourer fleet when her engineering officer's voice cut through the tactical chatter with an urgency that made everyone on the bridge look up from their stations. "Commander, you need to see this immediately. I'm reading massive energy signatures from the destroyed Devourer vessels, but they're not dissipating. They're being absorbed by something." Chen frowned at her tactical display. The remains of the first Devourer ships they destroyed were scattered across several thousand cubic kilometers of space, but the debris wasn't behaving like normal wreckage. Instead of cooling and dispersing, the fragments seemed to be maintaining their internal energy somehow, creating field effects that were playing havoc with nearby sensor readings. Absorbed by what, Chief? Nakamura's fingers flew over her console, pulling up readouts that showed energy flows invisible to the human eye. Commander, I think the Devourers aren't just ships. They're connected to something bigger. When we destroy one, its energy doesn't disappear. It gets transferred somewhere else through some kind of quantum link. Lieutenant Torres looked up from his own station, his face pale. Commander, if that's true, then we're not really killing them. We're just redistributing them. The implications hit Chen like a physical blow. If the Devourers were connected through some kind of network, then destroying individual ships might not be enough. They might need to sever that connection somehow, but human weapons weren't designed for that kind of sophisticated warfare. Or were they? Chen called up the technical specifications for her ship, scrolling through systems that hadn't been activated in decades. The Defiance had been built during humanity's most paranoid era, when military planners assumed they would eventually fight enemies they couldn't even imagine. As a result, older human ships carried weapons that most modern strategists considered completely unnecessary. Chief, what do you know about the Omega protocols? Nakamura's eyes widened. Every engineer who'd served on an old human ship knew about the Omega protocols, but most considered them theoretical curiosities. They were weapon systems designed for scenarios that human strategists hoped would never occur. Commander, the Omega systems are completely untested in actual combat. They were designed for fighting enemies that used exotic physics. But the power requirements are enormous. We'd have to shut down everything non-essential, including life support in some sections. Chen studied the tactical situation. The human squadron had managed to destroy or disable nearly 24 Devourer ships, but more kept appearing from the darkness beyond the system's edge. Worse, the destroyed vessels were somehow sharing their experiences with the newcomers. The newer Devourer ships were already adapting to human tactics, moving in ways that made them harder to target with conventional weapons. Nakamura pulled up technical schematics that hadn't been accessed in over a century. The primary Omega weapon is a gravitational resonance projector. It's designed to create artificial gravity wells that can disrupt exotic matter arrangements and quantum entanglement networks. Theoretically, it could sever the connection between individual Devourer ships and whatever they're linked to. Chen looked around her bridge at the faces of her crew. They were tired, scared, but still determined. Behind them, on the planet Haven, over 1 billion refugees waited to learn whether they would live or die based on the decisions made in this room. Theoretically, Chief. Commander, if I'm wrong about how this works, activating the Omega systems could tear a hole in space-time that would consume this entire star system. The gravitational effects alone could collapse the local stellar structure. Chen nodded slowly. It was the kind of weapon that only humans would have built, designed by engineers who believed that any enemy worth fighting was worth destroying completely, even if it meant destroying yourself in the process. Signal the squadron. All ships are to activate Omega protocols on my mark. The response from her captains was immediate. Captain Rodriguez, Vengeance confirms Omega capability. Ready to proceed on your signal. Captain Kim, Retribution standing by for Omega activation. One by one, the old human warships reported their readiness to deploy weapons that had never been used in actual combat. Admiral Zefhei's voice cut across the communication channels, filled with alarm. Commander Chen, our sensors are detecting massive energy buildups aboard your vessels. What are you preparing to activate? Chen smiled grimly. Admiral, you might want to move your remaining ships to a safe distance. We're about to field test some human technology that we've been keeping in reserve. The truth was more complex than that. The Omega protocols weren't kept in reserve so much as they were kept secret. When humanity joined the galactic community, they'd been required to submit detailed specifications for all their military technology. The human government had complied, but they'd somehow failed to mention weapons systems that they classified as emergency use only and not for deployment except under extinction-level threat conditions. Today definitely qualified. Chen watched her engineering displays as power was rerouted throughout the ship. Non-essential systems shut down one by one as the Defiance's massive fusion reactors directed their full output toward weapons that had been built but never tested. The ship's lights dimmed, gravity plates flickered, and the normal hum of shipboard systems faded to an ominous silence. "Chief, what's our status on the resonance projectors? Charging to 40%, 60%, 80%. Commander, we're approaching the point of no return. If we activate these systems at full power, there's no guarantee we'll be able to shut them down again." Chen keyed her communication system to the squadron frequency. "All ships, this is Defiance. Omega protocols are authorized. Target the largest concentration of enemy vessels and fire on my mark." She paused, looking out through the reinforced windows at the alien ships that had seemed so beautiful and graceful just hours before. Now they looked fragile and inadequate, vessels built by civilizations that had forgotten what it meant to fight for survival. "Mark!" The Omega systems activated with a sound like reality tearing. Chen had expected noise, light, some kind of dramatic effect. Instead, the gravitational resonance projectors operated in almost complete silence, creating distortions in space-time that were felt rather than seen. The effect was subtle at first, just a slight warping of starlight around the target area. Then the distortions began to cascade, spreading outward in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The Devourer ships caught in the resonance field began to change. Their perfect darkness flickered, revealing structures underneath that no human eye had ever seen before. For just a moment, Chen glimpsed what the enemy vessels really were. Not ships in any conventional sense, but nodes in a vast network that stretched across dimensions she couldn't even name. Then the connections began to break. The sound that came through the hull this time was different from the death scream of the first Devourer ship. This was the sound of a network being severed, of communication channels being cut and control systems being disconnected. Across the entire enemy fleet, ships that had moved with perfect coordination suddenly began operating independently, their actions becoming erratic and uncoordinated. "Commander," Torres called from his station, excitement evident in his voice, "enemy tactical coordination is breaking down. They're not sharing information anymore." Each ship is operating in isolation. Chen allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before returning to the tactical situation. The Omega weapons had worked, but they'd also drained her ship's power reserves to dangerous levels. The Defiance was running on backup systems, her weapons offline and her defenses compromised. But around her, the rest of the human squadron was in similar condition, their crews working frantically to restore power to critical systems. They'd fired their secret weapon and revealed capabilities that the galaxy had never suspected, but now they were vulnerable. The Devourers, however, were in chaos. Ships that had fought with perfect tactical coordination were now operating as individuals, making decisions based on limited information and conflicting priorities. Some attempted to continue their attack on Haven. Others tried to retreat to the system's edge, and still others seemed to be attempting to re-establish their lost network connections. Admiral Zephi's voice crackled over the communication system, filled with amazement and growing hope. "Commander Chen, whatever you did has completely disrupted their command structure. Our remaining ships are requesting permission to resume the attack." Chen looked at her power display. The Defiance would need at least 20 minutes to restore full weapon power, but her railguns were already coming back online. Around her, the other human ships were in similar condition, battered but functional. "Admiral, you're cleared to attack. But be careful, we don't know how long the disruption will last." The surviving alien ships moved forward with new confidence, their sophisticated weapons finally finding targets that weren't protected by impossible physics. Energy beams and exotic particle streams began striking Devourer hulls that were no longer reinforced by network effects, carving through alien armor with devastating efficiency. But Chen wasn't watching the alien attack. She was studying the technical readouts from the Omega weapons, trying to understand what they'd actually accomplished. The gravitational resonance projectors had created effects that went beyond simple physics, reaching into dimensions that human science barely acknowledged existed. "Chief," she called to Nakamura, "how much power do we need to fire the Omega systems again?" "Commander, we'd need to completely drain our fusion cores. The ship would be dead in space until we could restart the reactors." Chen nodded. It was a desperate option, but she had a feeling they might need it again before this battle was over. The Devourers had been caught off guard once, but they were adapting quickly. Already, some of the enemy ships were beginning to move in coordination again, suggesting they were finding ways to restore their network connections. The battle was far from over, but humanity had revealed that their primitive technology included weapons that could strike at the very foundations of reality itself. The galaxy had spent centuries assuming that human military doctrine was obsolete, but they never considered that humans might have built weapons designed to fight enemies that didn't exist yet. Today, those theoretical enemies had finally arrived, and humanity was ready for them. Chen settled back into her command chair and began planning the next phase of the attack. The Devourers had underestimated human ingenuity once. She wasn't going to give them the chance to make that mistake again. The counterattack came 12 hours later, just as Chen was beginning to hope they might have actually won. She was in the ship's mess hall, forcing herself to eat something that barely qualified as food, when the proximity alarms began screaming throughout the Defiance. Chen dropped her meal pack and ran for the bridge, arriving to find her night watch crew staring at sensor displays that showed impossible readings. "Report," she snapped, dropping into her command chair. Lieutenant Torres, who had been pulling double shifts since the battle began, looked up from his console with exhaustion and fear written across his face. "So, Commander, we've got massive contacts emerging from hyperspace at the system's edge, but these aren't like the ships we fought before." Chen studied the tactical display, feeling a cold dread settle into her stomach. The new arrivals were enormous, each one easily 10 times the size of the largest Devourer ship they'd encountered so far. But size wasn't what worried her most. These vessels were moving with the kind of coordination that the Omega weapons had disrupted, suggesting they operated on different principles than the fleet humanity had just defeated. "Analysis, Lieutenant. What are we looking at?" "Commander, these ships appear to be... They're building something in the outer system using the destroyed Devourer ships as raw materials. Our long-range sensors are picking up massive energy signatures and what looks like industrial fabrication." Chen called up the detailed sensor readings, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The new Devourer ships weren't attacking Haven or moving to engage the remaining defense fleet. Instead, they were systematically collecting the wreckage of their destroyed comrades and using it to construct something that human sensors couldn't properly identify. Chief Nakamura's voice came from the engineering station, tight with controlled panic. "Commander, whatever they're building is generating gravitational anomalies. The local space-time structure is being warped on a massive scale." Admiral Zefhay's communication came through on the priority channel, his normally melodious voice harsh with strain. "Commander Chen, our scientists believe the Devourers are constructing some form of dimensional gateway. If they succeed, they could bring in reinforcements from elsewhere. We need to stop them immediately." Chen looked at her tactical situation. The human squadron had spent the last 12 hours repairing battle damage and restoring power to critical systems, but they were still operating at reduced capacity. The alien ships of the defense fleet were in better condition, but their previous attempts to engage Devourer construction efforts had proven disastrous. The new enemy vessels seemed to be specifically designed to counter the weapons that had proven effective against their predecessors. "Chief, what's our status on the Omega systems?" "Commander, we've restored primary power to the gravitational resonance projectors, but the focusing arrays are still damaged from our last engagement. If we fire them again, there's a high probability they'll overload and take out half the ship's systems." Chen studied the readouts showing the enemy construction project. Whatever the Devourers were building was nearly complete, its structure warping space around it in ways that made her eyes water to look at directly. Once finished, it would undoubtedly serve as a gateway for reinforcements that would make the current fleet look insignificant by comparison. But there was another option, one that Chen had hoped they wouldn't need to use. She called up a set of technical specifications that carried the highest security classification in the human military database. "Chief, what do you know about the Genesis protocols?" The engineering officer's face went pale. "Commander, the Genesis protocols are completely theoretical. They've never been tested, not even in computer simulations. The power requirements alone would require us to overload every fusion reactor simultaneously." Chen nodded grimly. The Genesis protocols were humanity's ultimate weapon, designed by engineers who had asked themselves a simple question. What would you need to completely destroy something that existed outside normal physics? Their answer had been characteristically human in its directness and terrifying in its implications. Explain it to me, Chief. In simple terms, Nakamura pulled up technical documents that carried warning labels in 17 languages. The Genesis weapon creates a localized Big Bang event, essentially tearing a hole in reality and allowing the fundamental forces of creation to remake a small region of space according to the laws of physics that existed in the first microseconds after the universe began. Anything caught in the effect zone would be rewritten at the quantum level. Lieutenant Torres looked up from his console, his young face filled with understanding and horror. Commander, if we use that weapon, there's no guarantee we'll survive the activation. The effect zone could expand beyond our ability to control it. Chen keyed her communication system to the squadron frequency. All ships, this is Defiance. I need captains to report to a secured channel for immediate tactical briefing. One by one, her fellow commanders acknowledged the order. These were officers who had served in humanity's old fleet during the long, quiet years when nothing important ever happened in the outer systems. They were professionals who understood that sometimes the most important decisions were made by people who would never live to see their consequences. Captains, Chen began when the secure channel was established. I'm transmitting technical specifications for the Genesis protocols. Study them quickly and tell me if your ships can implement them. There was silence on the channel for several minutes as humanity's most experienced officers reviewed weapons specifications that had been classified since their ships were first launched. When they finally responded, their voices carried the weight of men and women who understood exactly what was being asked of them. Captain Rodriguez spoke first. Vengeance confirms Genesis capability. Commander, these specifications indicate that activation will require complete power core overload. Survival probability is minimal. Captain Kim's voice was steady as steel. Retribution also confirms capability. Commander, request permission to volunteer for the mission. One by one, the other captains reported the same thing. Their ancient ships, built during humanity's most paranoid period, were fully capable of implementing weapons that could remake reality itself. They were also fully aware that doing so would almost certainly result in the complete destruction of their vessels and crews. Chen looked around her bridge at the faces of officers who had served with her for years. They were tired, scared, but still determined to do whatever was necessary to protect the billion refugees on Haven. She thought about the families waiting on the planet below, the children who had never known war, the elderly who had survived the Devourer attacks on their home worlds only to face the possibility of extinction in this final battle. All ships prepare to implement Genesis protocols. Target designation is the enemy construction site. We'll coordinate the activation to ensure maximum effect overlap. Admiral Zeph Hayes' voice cut across the channel, filled with desperate urgency. Commander Chen, our analysts estimate that the Devourer Gateway will be operational within 6 hours. If they succeed in bringing in reinforcements, no force in the galaxy will be able to stop them. Chen checked her chronometer. 6 hours was barely enough time to prepare the Genesis weapons for activation, assuming everything went perfectly. But she'd learned over the years that nothing ever went perfectly in combat. Admiral, have your ships escort the evacuation vessels away from Haven. Get as much distance as possible between the civilian population and our firing position. Commander, the evacuation ships can't achieve safe distance in the time available. The refugees will be within the potential effect zone of your weapons. Chen felt the weight of command settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. She was being asked to risk 1 billion innocent lives on the possibility that human weapons could succeed where the galaxy's most advanced technology had failed. But the alternative was certain extinction for everyone in the galaxy. Admiral, I understand the risks, but if we don't stop the Devourers here, there won't be anywhere left to evacuate to. Chen turned to her crew, looking at each face individually. These were people who had signed up for patrol duty in the quiet outer systems, who had never expected to fight the most important battle in galactic history. But they were also humans, and humans had a long tradition of doing impossible things when the alternative was unacceptable. Chief, begin Genesis Protocol initialization. All hands to emergency stations. Throughout the Defiance, emergency klaxons began sounding as the ship's crew prepared for an operation that would either save the galaxy or destroy everything they'd been trying to protect. In engineering sections, technicians began the delicate process of preparing fusion reactors for deliberate overload. On the bridge, officers ran through checklists for weapons that had never been fired in anger. And in the outer system, the Devourer construction project neared completion, its alien geometries warping space around it in preparation for the arrival of forces that would make humanity's worst nightmares seem trivial by comparison. The race was on, and the stakes were nothing less than the continued existence of intelligent life in the galaxy. Chen settled into her command chair and began the countdown to humanity's final gambit. Either the Genesis protocols would work, or everyone would die learning why they'd never been tested. The Genesis weapons fired at exactly 0347 hours ship time. Chen had expected light, sound, some kind of dramatic effect that would mark humanity's final throw of the dice against extinction. Instead, the weapons activated with a silence so complete that it seemed to swallow all sensation. For a moment that lasted either forever or no time at all, the universe held its breath. Then creation began. The effect started as a point of absolute light at the heart of the Devourer construction site, a brilliance so pure that it existed beyond the visible spectrum. Chen watched through sensors that were designed to observe stellar phenomena as reality unfolded itself around that point of origin. Fundamental forces sorting themselves out according to rules that predated the existence of matter itself. The Devourer Gateway, a structure that had warped space-time with its alien geometries, simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not dispersed, but edited out of reality by forces that rewrote the local universe according to more fundamental laws. Where moments before there had been impossible architecture stretching across dimensional boundaries, now there was only empty space filled with the kind of primordial energy that had last existed 13 billion years ago. "My God," whispered Lieutenant Torres from his station. "Commander, the effect zone is expanding. Spatial displacement is accelerating beyond our projections." Chen forced herself to focus on the tactical situation rather than the awesome spectacle unfolding before them. The Genesis weapons had worked, but they'd worked too well. The localized Big Bang event was growing larger than the computer models had predicted, consuming Devourer ships and remaking the space they occupied according to the laws of physics that had governed the universe's first moments. "All ships emergency burn. Get us away from the expansion zone." Around her, the ancient human warships responded with the kind of acceleration that would have killed the crews of more sophisticated vessels. The Defiance's massive engines roared to life, pushing the ship away from the growing bubble of newborn reality at velocities that made the hull groan with stress. But even as they fled, Chen could see that some of her ships weren't going to make it. The UES Retribution, Captain Kim's vessel, had suffered engine damage in the earlier fighting and couldn't match the acceleration of the other ships. The expansion zone was overtaking her stern sections, reality rewriting itself along her hull in patterns of light that hurt to observe. Captain Kim's voice came over the communication system, calm and professional even as his ship was consumed by forces beyond human comprehension. "This is Retribution. We're not going to clear the effect zone, tell my crew's families they died protecting something worth saving." Chen watched helplessly as the Retribution vanished into the expanding sphere of Genesis energy. But instead of being destroyed, the ship seemed to be transformed, its molecular structure reorganized according to physical laws that existed only in the universe's infancy. When the transformation was complete, what emerged was still recognizably a starship, but one built from materials that shouldn't exist in normal space. "Commander," called Chief Nakamura from her engineering station, "we're receiving a transmission from the Retribution. Captain Kim is reporting that his ship is intact, but changed." Chen stared at her communication display in amazement. "Retribution, this is Defiance. Report your status. Kim's voice came back, filled with wonder and confusion. Defiance, we're different. Our whole composition has been altered at the subatomic level. We're reading material densities that shouldn't be possible, energy flows that violate conservation laws. But the ship is functional, and the crew is unharmed. Chen looked at the tactical display, trying to understand what had happened. The Genesis effect zone had finally stabilized, creating a region of space roughly 1,000 kilometers across where the laws of physics operated according to rules that predated the formation of galaxies. Within that zone, the Devourer construction site had been completely erased and replaced with something else. Admiral HFY's voice crackled over the communication system, filled with amazement and barely controlled panic. Commander Chen, our sensors are detecting massive gravitational anomalies from the Genesis zone. Whatever you've created, it's affecting stellar mechanics across the entire system. Chen called up the long-range sensor reading, studying the data with growing concern. The Genesis effect wasn't just local anymore. The fundamental forces unleashed by the weapons were propagating outward through space-time, creating ripples that would eventually reach every corner of the galaxy. Chief, what are we looking at here? Will the effect continue to expand? Nakamura studied her readings with the kind of concentration that came from trying to understand physics that existed beyond normal scientific theory. Commander, the expansion has stopped, but the zone itself is stable. It's like we've created a pocket of the early universe, a region where matter and energy operate according to more fundamental principles. Chen pondered the implications. They'd stopped the Devourers from completing their gateway, but in doing so, they'd created something that might be even more dangerous. The Genesis Zone was proof that human weapons could rewrite reality itself, a capability that no species in galactic history had ever possessed. But there was another aspect to consider. The Retribution had been transformed by the Genesis effect, emerging from the zone as something more than a normal starship. If the same transformation could be applied deliberately, Lieutenant Torres signal all remaining Devourer ships, inform them that humanity wishes to discuss terms. Torres looked at her with confusion. Commander, the Devourers don't negotiate. Every species that's tried to communicate with them has been consumed. Chen smiled grimly. Lieutenant, the Devourers have never faced opponents who could unmake reality itself. I suspect they're more interested in talking now than they were 12 hours ago. The response came faster than Chen had expected. Instead of the incomprehensible alien sounds that had characterized previous Devourer communications, the signal came through in perfect standard galactic. Human vessels, this is the entity you designate as Devourer. We acknowledge your demonstration of capability. Communication is acceptable. Chen felt a chill run down her spine. The aliens had never spoken in recognizable language before, suggesting that humanity's display of force had changed something fundamental about the relationship between the species. Devourer vessels, this is Commander Chen of the Human Defense Fleet. State your intentions regarding this star system and its inhabitants. Commander Chen, our previous objectives are no longer viable. The Genesis effect has created conditions that interfere with our primary mission parameters. We require... Chen exchanged glances with her officers. The Devourers, who had consumed 12-star systems without pause, were actually asking to negotiate. The implications were staggering. What are your terms? We propose cessation of hostile activities in exchange for access to Genesis technology. Our species requires the capability to survive in modified reality zones. Your weapons have demonstrated methods we had not considered. Chen realized what was happening. The Devourers weren't just invaders seeking to consume the galaxy. They were refugees themselves, fleeing from something even worse than they were. The Genesis weapons had shown them a potential solution to whatever threat had forced them to become predators in the first place. Admiral HFY, she called on the fleet frequency, I need an immediate conference with all surviving ship commanders and government representatives. We've got a situation that's bigger than just this battle. Over the next several hours, as the various species of the galaxy struggled to understand what humanity had accomplished, Chen found herself at the center of negotiations that would reshape the balance of power throughout known space. The Genesis technology represented the ability to rewrite reality itself, but it also offered the possibility of creating safe havens for species threatened by forces beyond conventional warfare. The Devourers revealed that they were fleeing the collapse of their home dimension, seeking resources to build new reality anchors that would allow their species to survive in normal space. The galaxy's advanced civilizations had seemed like the perfect source of the energy they needed, but humanity's weapons offered a more elegant solution. In the end, the agreement was simpler than anyone had expected. Humanity would share the principles behind Genesis technology in exchange for the Devourers' advanced understanding of dimensional mechanics. Together, they would work to create stable zones where species threatened by cosmic-scale disasters could find refuge. The war ended not with conquest or surrender, but with the recognition that the universe was far more dangerous than any single species had realized. Humanity's ancient spacecraft, dismissed as primitive relics by the galaxy's advanced civilizations, had proven that sometimes the oldest solutions were the most effective. 6 months later, Chen stood on the bridge of the rebuilt Defiance, watching construction crews install dimensional stabilizers based on hybrid human-devourer technology. Around her, the Genesis Zone had been converted into a research station, where scientists from dozens of species worked to understand the fundamental forces that governed reality itself. The galaxy had learned to respect humanity's military technology, but more importantly, they'd learned to respect humanity's approach to impossible problems. When faced with extinction, humans didn't retreat or despair. They built weapons capable of remaking the universe and then used them to create something better than what had existed before. Admiral HFY, now serving as the director of the Genesis Research Consortium, approached Chen with a datapad containing the latest reports from exploration teams. "Commander, our deep space sensors are detecting additional dimensional instabilities beyond the galactic rim. It appears the cosmic threat that displaced the Devourers is still active." Chen looked out at the stars, thinking about the ancient human ships that even now patrolled the galaxy's borders. Ships built by paranoid engineers who had assumed that someday humanity would face enemies they couldn't even imagine. Those engineers had been right, but they'd also been prepared. "Admiral," Chen said with a smile that was equal parts confidence and anticipation, "I think it's time the galaxy learned about our other secret weapons." The Genesis protocols were just the beginning. The universe was vast and dangerous, filled with threats that could unmake reality itself. But humanity had spent centuries preparing for exactly that kind of challenge, building weapons and developing tactics that others considered impossible or insane. The galaxy's ancient spacecraft had saved them all. Chen had a feeling they were just getting started. In the depths of space, ancient human warships continued their patrol routes, their crews ready to face whatever impossible threats the universe might send their way. They flew in vessels that the galaxy had once dismissed as primitive relics, but which had proven to be exactly what civilization needed when everything else failed. Sometimes the old ways were the best ways, and sometimes the most important battles were won by people who refused to accept that anything was truly impossible. The stars awaited, vast and full of challenges that would test the limits of human ingenuity. But humanity was ready, armed with weapons built by engineers who had learned that the best defense against the unknown was to make sure you could break anything that threatened what you cared about. The ancient fleet sailed on, guardians of a galaxy that had finally learned to appreciate the value of building things to last. They scoffed at our ancient spacecraft until those artifacts crushed the enemy Armada. Top HFY Stories.